Clara Bennett did not cry when they laughed at her. She had learned a long time ago that tears only gave cruel people something to celebrate. So she stood straight in the middle of that crowded general store, her hands trembling at her sides, her jaw locked so tight it ached, and she looked every single smiling face dead in the eye. They thought they were sending her somewhere she would break. They were wrong. If this story moves you, subscribe to this channel and leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The summer of 1884 arrived in Willow Creek, Montana, the way it always did, without mercy. The heat came first, rolling across the open prairie in heavy, breathless waves that turned the main road to dust and baked the wooden storefronts until they cracked along the seams. By July, the town smelled like dry grass and horse sweat and something else underneath something older and harder to name. The smell of a place that had decided long ago exactly who mattered and who did not. Clara Bennett had lived inside that decision her entire life. She was 24 years old, with a face people called pretty when they forgot themselves. Wide brown eyes that caught light in a way that made strangers pause. Dark hair she kept braided neatly under a cotton bonnet, and a smile that arrived slowly and meant something when it did. She was tall for a woman with broad shoulders, built for work, and she was heavy, genuinely significantly heavy. The kind of woman who took up real space in a room and had spent years apologizing for it without ever using those words. She had never been engaged. She had never been courted. She had been told in 100 different ways that those things were not available to someone who looked the way she looked. So Clara worked. She worked at Hargrove's General Store, arriving before dawn to stack flour sacks and crates of dry goods. Lifting things that men twice her size complained about, keeping inventory in a careful ledger she had taught herself to maintain. She swept the boardwalk. She carried deliveries to elderly neighbors who could not manage the weight themselves. She smiled at customers who did not smile back. She said thank you to people who had never once thanked her. She did it all without complaint. And still Willow Creek looked at Clara Bennett and saw only one thing: the fat girl. The one you could laugh at and feel better about yourself. The one who would never leave because she had nowhere else to go. The one who had been so thoroughly taught her place that she had nearly stopped questioning it. Nearly. It was a Tuesday morning when everything changed, or rather, when the thing that would change everything was set into motion by people who thought they were simply amusing themselves. The general store was crowded that morning, which was unusual for a Tuesday. But word had traveled through town faster than the summer heat that Jacob Walker had sent a message down from his ranch. He needed help. Real help, not a ranch hand for fence mending or a seasonal wrangler passing through. He needed someone to manage the day-to-day running of the property. The livestock, the barn, the scheduling, the 100 invisible tasks that kept a working ranch from collapsing into itself. Jacob Walker's ranch had been collapsing for 3 years. Everyone in Willow Creek knew the story, or thought they did. Jacob Walker had come to Montana 12 years ago with a reputation that preceded him, one of the finest cattle drivers in the territory. A man who had moved 3,000 head of longhorn across 2 states without losing a single animal, who could read weather by the color of the sky and track water sources across 60 miles of open land. He had bought 400 acres north of town, built up a proper spread-run cattle that won prizes at the regional fair, and for a few years, it looked like Jacob Walker was going to be one of those rare men who actually built exactly what he set out to build. Then his wife died. Then his son died 6 months after her, a fever that came fast and left nothing, and Jacob Walker, who had survived droughts and stampedes and 3 separate attempts by competing cattle outfits to run him out of business, had been undone by grief in a way that all of those harder things had never managed. He still lived on the ranch. He still kept cattle, though far fewer than before. He still kept horses, which he had always preferred to people. But the operation had shrunk. Workers stayed for a few weeks and left not because Jacob was cruel, but because he was unreachable. He didn't fire people. He simply withdrew so completely from human interaction that being around him felt like working beside a ghost. People couldn't stand it for long. 3 years. 3 years of slow, steady decline. And now Jacob Walker had finally sent word that he needed help. The women gathered in Hargrove's store that morning treated the news the way they treated most news, as entertainment. Mrs. Eleanor Hayes stood at the center of the group the way she always did. She was the wife of the town's only banker, which in Willow Creek meant she occupied a position somewhere between royalty and local government. She was a thin, handsome woman with a talent for making cruelty sound like concern, and she had not liked Clara Bennett since the day Clara had politely corrected an arithmetic error in Eleanor's household account 3 years ago. The Walker Ranch. Eleanor was saying, her voice carrying across the store with the ease of someone who had never once worried about being overheard. Could you imagine? The man's let the place go to absolute ruin. Whoever goes up there is going to spend the first month just shoveling out that barn. I heard the fences are all down, said Margaret Pruitt, who ran the dressmaker's shop and rarely formed an opinion that wasn't first formed by Eleanor. And the bunkhouse roof caved in last winter. Who would even take a job like that? Said a younger woman. Clara didn't know well, a recent arrival from St. Louis, who had decided very quickly that agreeing with Eleanor Hayes was the wisest social strategy in Willow Creek. There was a pause. The kind of pause Clara had learned to recognize. The kind that meant she was about to become the punchline. Eleanor turned. Slowly, the way people do when they want the moment to feel deliberate. Her eyes found Clara behind the counter, where Clara was quietly restocking a shelf of tin goods and pretending she could not hear every word. Why Clara should go, Eleanor said. Her voice was light, almost kind, which was the most dangerous register it ever reached. She's certainly strong enough for the heavy work. And it isn't as though she has any other arrangements keeping her here. The laughter started soft and grew. Not everyone in the store laughed. Mrs. Aldrich, the schoolteacher, looked down at her hands. Old Mr. Finney stared at his boots. But enough people laughed. Enough people that the sound filled the room and bounced off the shelves and landed squarely on Clara's chest, like something thrown. Clara's hands went still on the tin she was holding. She did not look up immediately. She gave herself 3 full seconds she had learned to count to make sure her face was arranged into something that was not pain. Then she looked up. Actually, she said, her voice coming out steadier than she felt. I was just reading Mr. Walker's notice this morning. Eleanor blinked. She had not expected a response. He's looking for someone with experience managing livestock and general operations, Clara continued. I've been managing inventory here for 4 years. I've helped 3 ranching families with their accounts during tax season, and I have more experience handling horses than anyone in this room. She paused. Does anyone else plan to apply? The silence was different from the laughter, heavier, more uncertain. Eleanor recovered quickly. She always did. Clara, sweetheart. The word was a small weapon, soft at the edges. You don't honestly think a man like Jacob Walker is going to hire you? I think Mr. Walker is looking for someone who can do the work, Clara said. And I can do the work. She reached under the counter and picked up the folded notice that Hargrove had tacked to the board that morning. She read the address. She already knew the address, she had memorized it the moment she saw it, but she made a show of reading it carefully, then folded the paper and placed it in her apron pocket. I'll let Mr. Hargrove know I'll be leaving early this afternoon to ride out and speak with him, she said. She turned back to the shelf. Behind her, she heard Eleanor say something to Margaret in a low voice, and she heard Margaret laugh. She heard the younger woman from St. Louis agree with something, and she heard the scrape of boots on floorboards as people shifted and resumed their conversations, satisfied that the small drama had concluded the way small dramas in Willow Creek always concluded, with Clara Bennett in her place and everything as it should be. What they did not see was Clara's hands. What they did not see was the way her fingers had gone white around the tin she was holding, pressing it hard enough that the metal bent slightly at the rim. What they did not see was the single controlled breath she pulled in through her nose and pushed out through her teeth. What they did not see was the decision forming behind her eyes. She left work 2 hours before her shift ended, which she had never done in 4 years of employment at Hargrove's general store. She told Mr. Hargrove she had a personal errand and would make up the time the following morning. He nodded without asking questions, which meant he had heard the exchange with Eleanor Hayes and felt guilty enough to be decent about it. Clara walked home to the small room she rented above the laundress's shop, changed into her work clothes, heavier canvas trousers she wore when she helped haul freight, a long-sleeved shirt against the sun, and packed a bag. She packed light. A change of clothes. Her ledger notebook. The small tin of salve she used on her hands after heavy work. Her mother's Bible, not because she was particularly devout, but because it was the only thing she owned that had belonged to her mother, and she never went anywhere without it. Then she sat on the edge of her bed for a moment. The room was small enough that she could touch both walls if she stretched her arms wide, which she had never done, but had calculated once during a particularly difficult night. The ceiling sloped on one side. The window looked out over the alley behind the laundress's shop, and in the summer, the smell from the dye vats could be overwhelming. She paid $2 a month for it, which left her with very little after food and necessities, and she had been living this way for 3 years and had never once let herself dwell too long on what it meant. She looked at the bag. She looked at the door. She thought about Eleanor Hayes's face when Clara had reached for the notice. The precise shape of Eleanor's surprise. The way her eyes had gone slightly too wide. The small involuntary pause before she recovered and deployed the word "sweetheart" like a throwing knife. Clara picked up the bag. She walked out. It was 4 miles to the Walker Ranch from the edge of town. Clara did not own a horse. She considered briefly asking to borrow one from the livery stable on Garrett Street. She knew Tom Garrett well enough, had helped him with his accounts 2 winters ago, but she decided against it. She was not sure why exactly, except that something in her wanted to arrive at Jacob Walker's ranch under her own power. Not borrowed, not dependent, her own. It took her just under 2 hours in the July heat. The road north of town turned from packed earth to loose gravel to 2 faint tracks pressed into dry grass, and she followed those tracks until the land opened up and she could see the ranch. It was not what she had imagined. She had heard the descriptions. The fences down the bunkhouse roof collapsed, the whole place gone to ruin since Jacob Walker lost himself to grief. She had expected something defeated-looking, something that matched the story people told about it. What she found was harder to classify. The land itself was extraordinary. 400 acres of Montana prairie rolling away from a low rise with mountains beginning their blue silhouette in the west, and a creek line cutting through the eastern third of the property. The grass was dry in places, but not dead. The main house was still standing, solidly built, the kind of construction that had been done by someone who intended to stay. The barn was large, and yes, it needed work. Fencing was down in several sections. The equipment shed had seen better years, but underneath the neglect, the bones of the place were sound. Clara stood at the gate. The gate itself was fine. She noticed solid timber with good hinges and looked at it all for a long moment. Then she heard footsteps. Jacob Walker came around the side of the barn, and Clara understood immediately why the women in Willow Creek still talked about him the way they did, despite 3 years of self-imposed isolation. How was tall, genuinely tall, the kind that made a man look like he was standing uphill from everyone else. Wide shoulders, the kind built by actual labor rather than performance. Dark hair that had gone gray at the temples, and a face that had been handsome once and was still something. Now not soft, not sharp. Something in between, with deep-set eyes that were the color of creek water on a cloudy day, and a jaw that hadn't met a razor in at least a week. He moved the way men moved when they had spent their whole lives outdoors, deliberate, unhurried, a little careful, in the way of someone who had learned that rushing at things led to injury. He stopped when he saw her. He looked at her the way people always looked at Clara, the first time, that quick involuntary assessment head to feet that she had grown so accustomed to that she barely flinched anymore. She kept her chin level and let him look. Then something passed across his face that she didn't expect. He looked back up and met her eyes, and the assessment was done, and what replaced it was something that looked almost like concentration. "You're here about the work," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir." "You walked from town?" "I did." He looked at her for another moment, not unkindly, just looking. "It's 4 miles in July heat," he said. "I'm aware." How was quiet for a moment. He had the quality she would come to realize of someone who had spent so long alone that he'd lost the habit of filling silences with noise. Most people found it unsettling. Clara, who had spent years being talked at by people who never actually listened, found it strangely comfortable. "I had some people come up here last month," he said finally. "Looking at the job. 3 men and a woman from over in Billings." He paused. None of them stayed for a second conversation. "I'm not from Billings," Clara said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. "What's your name?" "Clara Bennett. I work at Hargrove's store in town. 4 years. I manage the inventory, the accounts, and the deliveries. I have some experience with horses. I worked with my uncle's breeding operation for 2 summers before I came to Willow Creek quarter horses mostly. And I'm not afraid of hard work." She said it plainly, without embellishment or apology. She had practiced it in her head on the walk over, not rehearsed it exactly, but settled it. Decided what she needed him to know, and stripped away everything that wasn't that. Jacob Walker looked at her. "Why do you want this job?" he asked. "The pay isn't generous. The work is hard. The accommodations." He glanced toward the bunkhouse, which had indeed partially collapsed. "Need some attention. Because the work is real," Clara said. "And because I'm good at it. And because I need a position that's worth the effort I put into it." She paused. "I've been stacking flour sacks for 4 years, Mr. Walker. I'm capable of considerably more than that." He held her gaze. "The women in town sent you up here, didn't they?" he said. Not a question again. He said it flat factual, the way you'd name a kind of weather. Clara felt heat that had nothing to do with the July sun move across her face. "Mrs. Hayes made a suggestion," she said carefully. "I chose to act on it. She meant it as an insult." "Yes, sir." "And you came anyway?" "Yes, sir." Jacob Walker was quiet for a long time. A horse moved somewhere in the barn. She could hear it shifting its weight, the soft percussion of hooves on packed earth. And from somewhere east of the house, a crow called twice and went silent. "I'll show you the barn," he said. "You tell me what you think needs to happen." He did not offer her the job that afternoon. He showed her the barn, which was in worse shape than the exterior suggested. 2 of the stall supports had rotted through, and the hayloft floor had soft spots. She tested carefully with 1 foot before trusting her weight. He showed her the tack room, which was chaos, equipment piled and tangled bridles thrown over saddles, a condition that told her the operation had been slowly hemorrhaging any kind of system. He showed her the horse pasture, where 4 animals moved in a group that kept to the far fence, skittish and underweight. She watched the horses. "They've been mishandled," she said. "The last man I hired for the horses left in a hurry," Jacob said. "He had a rough approach." "I can see that." She kept her voice neutral. "They'll come around. It takes time." He looked at her sideways. "You know horses." "I told you I did." "Lots of people tell me things." "Yes," she said. "I imagine they do." They stood at the fence rail for a moment, watching the horses cluster and shift. Then Clara made a decision. She walked to the gate and let herself into the pasture without asking permission. She heard Jacob make a sound behind her, a quick intake of breath, because a frightened horse of that size was a genuine hazard, but she was already moving. Slowly. Not toward the horses, but diagonally at an angle which was not threatening. She kept her head turned slightly to the side. She kept her steps quiet and measured. She held 1 hand low and open. The horses watched her. The smallest one, a bay mare with a white star on her forehead, took 2 steps toward her, then stopped. Clara stopped too. She waited. The bay took 3 more steps, stopped again. Clara waited. It took 11 minutes, she counted. When the bay finally pressed her nose into Clara's open hand, the breath that came out of that horse was the kind that means something has released deep in the chest all the way down. The other horses drifted closer. Clara stroked the bay's neck slowly. She looked back at Jacob Walker. He was standing at the fence with his arms folded on the rail, watching her with an expression she couldn't fully read. Something in it had shifted since she'd walked into the pasture. Something in the quality of his attention was different. "When can you start?" he asked. Clara looked at the bay mare. "Monday," she said. "I have some arrangements to settle in town." Jacob nodded. She walked back toward the fence, and he stepped back to give her room to climb through the rail. He didn't offer to help her. She hadn't expected him to, and didn't need him to, but he did reach out and hold the top rail steady so it didn't shift under her hands. It was a small thing. She thought about it the entire walk back to Willow Creek. The arrangements she needed to settle in town were 3 things she gave notice to Mr. Hargrove, who looked genuinely sorry to lose her and gave her 2 weeks' wages as a farewell, which she had not expected, and which she tucked into the inside of her boot for the walk home, because she trusted the boot more than her pockets. She spoke to her landlady, Mrs. Croft, who told her she could have the rest of the month since she'd already paid, and then rented the room to someone else by the following Tuesday, which Clara had fully expected. And she went to the library and borrowed every book they had on horse training. There were 2. She read them both before Sunday. The women of Willow Creek found out. Clara had taken the job at Walker Ranch on Friday evening when Eleanor Hayes ran into Mr. Hargrove at the post office, and he mentioned in passing that he'd need to find a replacement for his inventory position. Eleanor arrived at Clara's room above the laundress's shop within the hour. Clara was there as it happened. She was packing. Eleanor stood in the doorway. She had not knocked. She was not the kind of woman who knocked on the doors of people she considered beneath her, and looked around the small room with an expression that managed to be both pity and contempt simultaneously. "This is foolishness, Clara," she said. Clara folded a shirt and placed it in her bag. "Jacob Walker is not going to keep you on," Eleanor continued. "He's going to take one look at you and send you back to town. And then you'll have no job and no room, and everyone will know why." "Then I suppose that's what will happen," Clara said. Eleanor stepped into the room, uninvited. "I'm saying this for your own good," she said, and there was something in her voice that almost sounded true. Almost because Eleanor Hayes was complicated, the way all cruel people were complicated. Which was to say, she had long ago convinced herself that her cruelty was a form of realism. "You don't belong up there. You're not that kind of woman. Jacob Walker is a respected man in this territory, and you—" "And I what, Mrs. Hayes?" Clara turned around. She was taller than Eleanor. She had never particularly noticed that before, or rather, she had noticed it and immediately discounted it, the way you discount any advantage that doesn't match what you've been told about yourself. But she noticed it now. She was standing in the center of her small room-packed bag at her feet, and she was looking down very slightly, but unmistakably, at Eleanor Hayes. "I'm what?" she said again. Eleanor's lips pressed thin. "You know what I mean," she said finally, which was the thing people said when they wanted to wound you without having to be accountable for the weapon. "Yes," Clara said. "I know exactly what you mean." She picked up her bag. "And I'm going anyway." She walked to the door. Eleanor stepped aside just barely. Just enough, but she stepped aside. Clara paused in the doorway. "Thank you for the suggestion about the ranch," she said. "It was the most useful thing you've ever said to me." She walked down the stairs. She arrived at Walker Ranch on Monday morning before the sun had fully cleared the eastern mountains. Jacob was already in the barn. He handed her a list written in a hand that was careful and deliberate, the kind of handwriting of someone who had not written often for a while and was thinking about each letter. The list had 17 items. Barn repairs, fence sections, animal schedules, supply inventory. A note at the bottom that said, "Horses first, everything else after." She looked at the list. "This is a month's worth of work," she said. "I know," Jacob said. "I'll need materials for the barn repairs, lumber, new hardware for the stall brackets. I'll get them. And the horses need to be seen by a veterinarian before I do anything else with them. The bay mare has something going on with her left foreleg. She's favoring it when she shifts weight." Jacob looked up from what he was doing. "You noticed that yesterday," he said. "Yes, sir." "From the pasture." "Yes, sir." He was quiet. "I'll send to Billings for the vet," he said. She nodded and turned toward the barn. "Miss Bennett," he said. She stopped. "There's a room in the main house," he said. "Off the kitchen. Small, but it has a window. You'll stay there." She turned back around slowly. "Mr. Walker," she said. There are people in town who would—" "There are people in town," Jacob said, "who have opinions about everything I do and always have. That's not my concern." He picked up a bucket. The room has a good lock on the door. My room is on the other side of the house. He met her eyes directly. You'll be safe. Clara Bennett looked at this man who had just said with no particular fanfare the exact thing she had needed someone to say to her without knowing she needed it. You'll be safe. She looked at him for a moment. Thank you, she said. She went to work. The first morning set the tone for everything that followed. Clara was up before Jacob. She had discovered on her first night in the small room off the kitchen that the ranch made sounds. She hadn't expected the particular creak of the main house, settling in the pre-dawn cold, the distant movement of horses in the pasture, the way the wind came across the open land without anything to break it. She had lain awake for a while listening, and then she had gotten up and gone to work, because lying still with her thoughts was a habit she had never found useful. She had the stove going and coffee made by the time Jacob appeared in the kitchen doorway. He stopped. He looked at the coffee. He looked at her. I didn't ask you to do that, he said. No, sir. This isn't a domestic position, Miss Bennett. I hired you for the ranch work. I know, she said. I made coffee because I wanted coffee. There was enough for two. She set a cup on the table. You don't have to drink it. He looked at the cup for a moment. Then he sat down and drank it. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. Outside, the sky was just beginning to go pale at the edges, and the horses were starting to move in the pasture. She could hear them, that soft rhythm she had already begun cataloging in her head. The bay mare moved differently from the others. That left foreleg was still the concern. The vet's coming Thursday, Jacob said. Good. His name's Alderman, out of Billings. He's the best in the territory. I know his name, Clara said. He did a piece in the Montana Agriculture Gazette about hoof abscess treatment. I read it last winter. Jacob set down his cup and looked at her. You read the Montana Agriculture Gazette, he said. I read anything I can get my hands on, she said. Mr. Hargrove let me take back issues when he was done with them. Jacob was quiet for a moment. Hargrove always was a decent man, he said finally. And there was something in his voice when he said it, not warmth exactly, but the memory of warmth, like touching a stone that had been in the sun. She filed that away without comment and finished her coffee. Then she went to work. The barn took 11 days, not because Clara was slow. She was not slow, but because the work was genuinely substantial. The rotted stall supports had to come out cleanly, without destabilizing the structure, which meant removing them in a specific order and getting temporary bracing in place before the permanent lumber went up. She had mapped the whole sequence in her notebook the first morning, sitting in the hayloft, with her legs hanging over the edge, looking at the ceiling and working through the geometry of it. Jacob watched her do this for about 10 minutes before he said, You're mapping the load sequence. Yes. Where did you learn to do that? My uncle's barn collapsed when I was 14, she said. We had to rebuild it from scratch. He walked me through every decision. She paused. He said if you understand why a thing stands, you can always figure out how to fix it when it falls. Jacob said nothing. But he didn't leave. He stayed, and after a while, he started handing her tools, without being asked, which was more useful than conversation, and she was beginning to understand more natural for him. They worked well together, which surprised her. She had expected him to be difficult in the specific way of solitary men who have stopped trusting other people's judgment, constantly. Second-guessing, constantly, asserting authority over small decisions to compensate for the larger ones they'd lost control of. She had known men like that. She had worked for men like that. Jacob was not like that. He had opinions, and he stated them plainly, and when she disagreed with him, she said so and explained her reasoning, and he listened, actually listened, the way she had almost forgotten men could. Sometimes he changed his mind. Sometimes he didn't. But he always heard her out, and the combination of that, the listening, the plainness, the absence of performance, made working beside him something she had to consciously stop herself from enjoying too openly. She was here to work. That was all. She repeated that to herself with some regularity. The veterinarian Dr. Alderman arrived on Thursday as promised. He was a compact, energetic man in his 50s with quick hands and a genuine love for horses that expressed itself as a kind of focused reverence when he was examining them. He confirmed what Clara had suspected about the bay mare early-stage laminitis in the left foreleg, manageable, if caught in time, which it had been. "Who spotted this?" he asked Jacob, pressing carefully along the mare's leg. "She did," Jacob said. Dr. Alderman looked up at Clara with an expression that recalibrated slightly. "How long have you been working with horses?" he asked. "On and off since I was 12, Clara said. 2 seasons on a breeding operation, mostly quarter horses." "This one would have been lame within the month if this had gone untreated," he said. He stood up and dusted his hands on his trousers. "You've got a good eye, Miss Bennett," she said. "Miss Bennett." He nodded, and it was the particular kind of nod that meant something beyond social courtesy. "Mr. Walker, I hope you're paying her what she's worth." Jacob glanced at Clara. "Working on it," he said. She looked away before he could see what crossed her face. The horses were the part of the work she loved, without reservation, without qualification, without the careful distance she maintained around everything else. There was a logic to horses that she had always found more reliable than the logic of people. They didn't lie to you. They didn't flatter you, and then say the opposite thing when you turned your back. They responded to what you actually were, not what you claimed to be, and they could tell the difference with an accuracy that should have humiliated humans more than it did. The bay mare. Clara had started calling her Ada privately in her head, and then out loud one morning without meaning to trust it her first. Then the big roan gelding, who had been the most skittish of the group, the one who would throw his head and shy sideways at sudden movement. He took 3 weeks, but one afternoon he walked up to her of his own accord at the fence and stood there with his forehead pressed against her shoulder, and she stood very still and let him do it, and felt something move in her chest that she couldn't name accurately. Jacob saw it. She didn't know he was there until he spoke. "He hasn't let anyone touch him in 8 months, he said. He was standing at the pasture gate, and his voice was quiet in the particular way of someone who doesn't want to disturb something. He was handled rough, Clara said. She kept her hand moving slowly along the roan's neck. He's not mean. He's careful. There's a difference, Jacob said. Yes. A pause. The last man who worked with him tried to break him back down, Jacob said. Thought if he scared him enough times, the horse would give up being afraid. That's not how it works. No, Clara said. It isn't. Another pause. Longer. That's not how most things work, Jacob said. She looked at him. He was looking at the roan, not at her, and his face was doing something complicated that he wasn't fully containing. His jaw was set. His eyes were quiet. He had the expression of a man who has just said something that meant more than he intended. She looked back at the horse. No, she said. It isn't. It was on the 3rd week that Willow Creek began paying attention. It started with Tom Garrett from the livery stable, who rode out on a Tuesday to discuss a land boundary question with Jacob, and ended up staying for 2 hours, during which he watched Clara rebuild a section of fence with a precision and speed that he later described to 3 separate people at the hardware store as the damnedest thing I've seen in 10 years of fence watching. Tom was not unkind. He reported what he saw accurately and without embellishment, which was perhaps why it spread the way it did. Within a week, there was a version of the story circulating in Willow Creek that included Clara single-handedly rebuilding the entire north fence line in a single afternoon, which was an exaggeration, but not by as much as one might expect. Then Dr. Alderman, on his follow-up visit for the bay mare, made a point of stopping at the general store on his way back through town and telling Mr. Hargrove that whoever had spotted that laminitis had saved Walker a horse worth $200 and had done it from casual observation in a pasture. Mr. Hargrove told his wife. His wife told the schoolteacher. The schoolteacher told 4 people. Clara knew none of this while it was happening. She was too busy. The daily rhythm of the ranch had established itself in a way that she found deeply, almost embarrassingly satisfying. Dawn coffee horses, morning check on the animals. Mid-morning whatever construction or repair work was on the current list. Afternoon horses again feed water, the slow patient work of bringing the herd back toward something like functional trust. Evening accounts. Planning the quiet conversation over supper that had become, without either of them making any announcement about it, a fixed part of the day. The supper conversations were where she learned Jacob Walker. Not quickly. He didn't give himself quickly. He answered questions directly but briefly, and she had figured out early that following up too fast closed him down rather than opening him further. So she would ask something, and he would answer, and she would let it sit, and sometimes he would add something more. A detail, a story, a piece of himself. She learned that he had grown up in Texas, that his father had been a cattle driver who had made and lost 3 fortunes and died without regret, that he had driven cattle himself for 12 years before coming to Montana, and that he had chosen Montana because the sky was different, bigger, he said with the slight self-consciousness of a practical man admitting to something impractical. She learned that he had built the ranch with his own hands, and the hands of 2 men who had been his friends, and that one of those men had died in an accident on the property 2 years after they'd broken ground, and the other had moved to Oregon. He told her about his wife one evening about 3 weeks in. He didn't announce the topic. They were talking about something else entirely, the supply of feed grain, which was running low and would need to be ordered. And then there was a pause, and he said, "Her name was Margaret." Clara did not move. She did not ask anything. She waited. "She came out here from Ohio," he said. "She'd never seen the West before she came here. She said the first time she saw the mountains, she cried." He was looking at the table. "She wasn't a person who cried easily. That's how I knew she meant it." Clara set down her fork. "She sounds remarkable," she said. "She was." He paused. "She was the best person I've known. Not because she was perfect, because she was honest. She said what she thought, and she didn't dress it up, and she was kind in a way that didn't have any performance to it. She was just kind." Clara said nothing. "She died in the winter of '81, he said. "Fever. It came fast." He paused again. "Daniel was 6 months old. He lasted until spring." The quiet in the room was different now. It had weight. "Mr. Walker," Clara said carefully. "Jacob," he said, not correcting her exactly, offering something. "Jacob," she said. "I'm sorry." He picked up his fork. "I know," he said. And then after a moment, "You're the first person who said that in 3 years that I believed." She looked at him. I wasn't looking back at her. He was cutting something on his plate with great attention, and she could see the set of his jaw and the way his shoulders were held too carefully. The particular posture of a man who has just let something out that he didn't fully plan to let out and is now managing the aftermath. "Why do you believe it?" she asked. He looked up. "Because you're not saying it to make me feel better," he said. "You're saying it because you mean it." She held his gaze for a moment. "Yes," she said. "I do." He looked back down at his plate. They finished the meal without talking, which was not uncomfortable. Which was, she realized later, startling that the silence between them had become something she could sit in without needing to fill. The first sign of trouble came from a direction she should have anticipated but hadn't, because she had been paying attention to the ranch and not to the town, which was exactly the kind of strategic error that Eleanor Hayes had been waiting for. It was Margaret Pruitt who arrived first. She came on a Friday afternoon, ostensibly to drop off a parcel for Jacob that had arrived at the post office, a seed catalog he'd ordered, which could have waited until his next trip to town, and which she had no particular reason to hand-deliver. But Margaret Pruitt was not delivering a catalog. She was conducting reconnaissance. Clara was in the yard working on the equipment shed when the buggy came up the road. She watched it approach, recognized Margaret, and felt something tighten in her stomach that she deliberately unknotted before the buggy stopped. "Miss Pruitt," she said. Margaret Pruitt looked at her. Looked at what she was doing. Looked at the repaired barn behind, the new fence sections, the horses moving in the pasture. Looked at all of it with an expression that went through several calculations before it settled on something. "Clara," she said. "I didn't realize you'd, that is, I hadn't heard you seem to be—" She paused and reorganized. "Is Mr. Walker available?" "He's in the north pasture," Clara said. "Is there something I can help you with? I have his post." Margaret held out the catalog and Clara took it. Margaret didn't immediately reach for her reins to turn the buggy around. "You've been here nearly a month," Margaret said. 26 days, Clara said. "People in town are talking." "I imagine so." Margaret looked at her with an expression that was difficult to read. It was not purely hostile, and that was the thing about Margaret Pruitt that made her harder to dismiss than Eleanor Hayes. Margaret had been unkind to Clara over the years, but she had not always been comfortable with her own unkindness. There had been moments, small ones, when Clara had caught Margaret looking at her with something that might have been regret. "They're saying it isn't appropriate," Margaret said. "A woman living on a man's property, without family, without a proper arrangement." "I have a proper employment arrangement," Clara said. "Signed and witnessed. Mr. Walker drew it up with the county clerk." Margaret blinked. "He did?" "He did, the first week." Clara had not planned to share this information, but something about the specific quality of Margaret's concern, which was not. She had decided entirely manufactured, made her offer it. "My room has a separate entrance off the kitchen. It locks from the inside." Margaret was quiet. "People are going to say things, Clara," she said finally, and her voice had dropped to something more private. "Whatever the arrangement is, people will say things. You know what this town is like." "I know exactly what this town is like," Clara said. "I've been living in it for 4 years." Margaret looked at her hands, then back up. "Are you happy here?" she asked. Clara paused. It was such an unexpected question that it knocked her off balance slightly, the way unexpected kindness always did. It hit harder than cruelty because she was less defended against it. "I'm doing work that matters," she said. "Yes." Margaret Pruitt nodded slowly. She gathered her reins. "I hope it lasts," she said. It sounded genuine. She turned her buggy and drove back toward Willow Creek. Clara stood in the yard for a moment holding the seed catalog. Then she put it on Jacob's desk and went back to work. She told Jacob about the visit that evening. He listened without interrupting. Then he was quiet for a moment. "Pruitt's not the problem," he said. "I know. Eleanor Hayes is the problem." "I know," Clara said. He pushed back from the table slightly and looked at the ceiling. "She's going to make this difficult." "She was going to make it difficult the day I took the job," Clara said. "That isn't new information." He looked at her. "Does it worry you?" She considered the question honestly. "It worries me for the ranch," she said. "If she stirs up enough opinion against us, against you, it could affect your business, your relationships in the town. That's a real concern." "I asked if it worries you," Jacob said. "Not the ranch." She looked at him. "I've been worrying about what people like Eleanor Hayes think of me since I was 9 years old," she said. "I've used up a significant amount of energy on that. I'm trying to stop." I was quiet. "Good," he said. He picked up his cup. "Because she's wrong about you." Clara went still. "She's wrong about everything she thinks she knows about you," he said with the flat certainty of someone stating observed fact. "She looked at you and saw the easiest story. She's been telling herself that story for so long she forgot it's not true." Clara looked at the table. "Jacob," she said. "I'm not saying it to be kind," he said. "I'm saying it because I've watched you work for 26 days, and I've seen what you are." He set his cup down. "And she doesn't have any idea." Clara took a slow breath. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and looked away, and she understood that this was as long as he could hold that kind of directness, that he had walked to the edge of something and said the thing, and now he needed to retreat back to more manageable terrain. She understood it because she did the same thing, had done the same thing her whole life, and recognizing it in someone else was a strange and disorienting comfort. The night the storm came was the night everything accelerated. It had been building all day. She could feel it in the air, that particular electric pressure that meant a serious summer storm was coming in off the mountains, the kind that could turn a dry creek bed into a torrent in 40 minutes. She had been watching the western sky all afternoon, and by early evening, she told Jacob they needed to bring the horses into the barn. He looked at the sky. "That's still a few hours out," he said. "I know," she said. "I want them in early." He looked at her. All right, he said. It took them an hour to get all 4 horses stalled and settled. The roan she had started calling him Dust, also privately, also now out loud, was the hardest. He didn't like the energy in the air, the charged feeling before a storm, and he was moving sideways and throwing his head. Clara went into the stall with him and stood quietly and kept her breathing slow and deliberate, the kind of conscious calm that horses could read from across a room, and after 15 minutes, he settled. Jacob was in the stall across from her. He watched her with the roan for a long moment. "How do you do that?" he asked. "Do what?" "Calm him down. You don't do anything. You just stand there." "I'm not doing nothing," she said. "I'm deciding to be calm, on purpose, all the way through." She stroked the roan's neck. Horses can feel the difference between someone pretending to be calm and someone who actually is. If you fake it, they know. Jacob was quiet. "I tried to do that," he said. "After Margaret, after Daniel. People would say I seemed calm, like I was handling it." She looked at him across the aisle between the stalls. "But you weren't," she said. "No." He looked at his hands. "I was locked down. That's not the same thing." The wind had picked up outside. She could hear it building, the first deep sound of the storm moving across the open land. "Locked down keeps you going," Clara said. "For a while." "For 3 years," he said. "And then," he looked up. "And then someone walks 4 miles in July heat to tell you she can do the work," he said. "And somehow that's the thing that cracks it." The first lightning struck somewhere to the west. She could see the flash through the barn's high window, and the thunder came after a long rolling sound that moved across the whole sky. Jacob didn't look away from her. Clara felt something shift in the air between them that had nothing to do with the storm, and everything to do with the storm. And she knew she had known for several days, if she was honest, that something was happening that she had not planned for and was not sure how to manage. She was not afraid of hard work. She was not afraid of Eleanor Hayes or the whole opinion of Willow Creek. She had walked 4 miles in July heat without flinching. But this the way. Jacob Walker was looking at her in the lamplight of his barn, while the storm broke over the ranch. This was the thing that made her heart move in a way she wasn't sure she had permission for. "I should check the water troughs," she said. She moved toward the barn door. "Clara." His voice stopped her. She turned. I was still in the roan stall, one hand resting on the horse's neck. His face was open, she thought. More open than she had ever seen it, like something that had been held shut had simply let go. "I'm glad you came," he said. "I want you to know that." She looked at him. "I know," she said. "I'm glad I came too." She pushed the barn door open and stepped out into the edge of the storm, and the wind hit her full in the face, and the rain was just starting, cold and real and necessary. She stood there for a moment, face up, and let it. Then she went to check the water troughs. Behind her. The barn was warm and lit, and she could hear the horses breathing, and she could hear Jacob moving, and she understood with a clarity that both frightened and exhilarated her, that the ranch was no longer just a place she was working. It was becoming something else. She didn't have a name for it yet. She was starting to think she wouldn't need one. The morning after the storm, Willow Creek sent its first real warning. A rider came up the ranch road at 8 in the morning, a young man Clara recognized as one of the clerk's boys from the county office. He was carrying a letter in an official envelope addressed to Jacob Walker. Jacob read it at the kitchen table. Clara watched his face change. It started with stillness. The specific quality of stillness that meant the information was bad, and he was processing it before he reacted. Then his jaw set. Then his eyes went very flat. He set the letter down on the table. "It's from the town council," he said. "Eleanor Hayes and 3 other members." He paused. "They're raising a complaint about the operation, claiming the ranch has become they're calling it a moral concern, for the county." Clara said nothing. She felt cold in a way that had nothing to do with the morning air. "They're suggesting," Jacob continued, "that employing a single woman in a residential capacity is improper, and that as a matter of community standards, the arrangement should be dissolved." He looked up from the letter. "They're trying to force you out," he said. "Yes," Clara said. "I know. They can't actually do anything," he said. "The employment contract is legal. The arrangement is documented. They don't have authority over my property." "They don't need authority," Clara said. She had known this. She had known it since the day Margaret Pruitt had driven out with the seed catalog, since the day she had taken the job, since the day she had stood in Hargrove's general store and said she was going to go. "They have opinion. In a small county, opinion is enough." Jacob looked at her. "What do you want to do?" he said. She looked at him across the kitchen table, at the man who had just asked her, not told her, not informed her of his decision, but asked her what she wanted to do. "I want to stay," she said. "And I want to keep working. And I don't want to give Eleanor Hayes the satisfaction of seeing me run." Jacob held her gaze for a long moment. Then he folded the letter and set it aside and picked up his coffee. "Then that's what we'll do," he said. Clara breathed. She picked up her cup. They drank their coffee, and then they went to work. Jacob folded the council's letter and put it in the drawer beneath the kitchen counter, and neither of them mentioned it again that day. That was the agreement they reached without words, the kind of agreement that forms between two people who have both learned that dwelling on a threat before you know its full shape wastes energy you might need later. But the letter changed something in the air around the ranch. Clara felt it the way she felt weather coming, not as a specific thing she could point to, but as a general shift in pressure. A tightening. The sense that the ground she was standing on, which had started to feel solid, was being tested from underneath. She worked harder. Which was, she understood, both a practical response and a completely irrational one, because the council's complaint had nothing to do with the quality of her work, and everything to do with the fact of her existence, in a space they had decided she didn't belong. But working harder was the only tool she had complete control over, so she picked it up and used it. The north fence was finished by the end of that week. The barn was not just repaired but improved. She had reorganized the stall layout to reduce crowding, which reduced the horses' stress, which Dr. Alderman confirmed on his third visit was part of why Ada's recovery was ahead of schedule. The tack room had gone from chaos to a system so logical that Jacob stood in the doorway one morning and stared at it for a full 30 seconds. "You alphabetized the bridles," he said. "I organized them by horse and function," she said. "Ada's tack is on the left hooks because she's fed and worked first. Dust's is in the center because he's handled midday. The other two." "You organized it by routine," he said. "Yes." He looked at the room for another moment. "I've been looking for that one piece of headstall for 6 months," he said, pointing to a bridle hanging neatly on a labeled hook. "It was under the oat bin," she said. "Buried. I found it the second day." He shook his head slowly. "You should have been running this place from the beginning," he said. She almost said something light in response, something deflecting. She had been deflecting compliments her entire life. It was the safest thing to do, because accepting them directly felt like setting yourself up for the moment when they were taken back. But she stopped herself. "Yes," she said simply. "I should have been." He looked at her. Something shifted in his face. Not surprise exactly, but a recognition, the look of a man recalibrating, adjusting his understanding of who he was dealing with. "Yes," he agreed. "You should have been." The second letter arrived 10 days after the first. This one was not from the council. It was addressed to Clara directly and had been sent through the post office in Willow Creek, which meant someone had gone out of their way to ensure she'd receive it. She recognized the handwriting on the envelope before she opened it, that particular cursive with the overly elaborate capital letters that Eleanor Hayes used on every piece of correspondence she produced, as though she were signing a document for posterity. Clara stood in the yard and read it. It was 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph expressed with abundant concern Eleanor's worry for Clara's welfare. The second paragraph outlined with tremendous compassion the damage being done to Clara's reputation by her continued presence at Walker Ranch. The third paragraph suggested with charitable generosity that Clara might return to town, where Eleanor had personally spoken to the owner of the boarding house on Mill Street, who would be willing to rent her a room at a reduced rate while Clara sought appropriate employment. Clara read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and put it in her apron pocket and went back to working on the water system, which needed new piping in the eastern section of the pasture and was a problem she had been solving in her head for 3 days. She did not tell Jacob about the letter immediately. She wasn't sure why not, because she wanted to hide it from him, but because she needed a day to decide what she felt about it. Eleanor had done her the courtesy at least of writing directly rather than going through Jacob. That was either a strategic decision or less likely an actual scruple. Clara was willing to consider both. What she kept returning to was the third paragraph. The boarding house on Mill Street. The reduced rate. The word appropriate tucked in there so neatly appropriate employment, as though Clara's current employment was somehow incorrectly sized for her. As though there were things that were appropriate for women like Clara and things that were not, and those categories had been determined by people like Eleanor Hayes long before Clara had any say in the matter. She thought about that boarding house room, the single window, the shared facilities, the careful invisibility of a life constructed around taking up as little space as possible. She had been living that life for 4 years in Willow Creek. She thought about Ada pressing her nose into her open hand. She thought about Dust standing with his forehead against her shoulder. She thought about Jacob's voice in the barn during the storm. I'm glad you came with that openness in his face that she knew had cost him something real to show. She thought about the tack room organized by routine. The 17-item list on her first morning. The coffee made before dawn that he hadn't asked for and had drunk every day since. She thought about what it felt like to do work that mattered. She went to find Jacob. How was at the back of the north pasture when she found him working on a section of post that had come loose in the storm. He heard her coming and looked up. Letter from Eleanor Hayes, she said, and held it out. He took it, read it, and handed it back. What do you want to do? He said. Same question as before. Direct, no preamble. I want to respond to it, Clara said. And I want your permission to do it plainly. He looked at her. You don't need my permission to respond to a letter, he said. It involves the ranch, she said. And your name. I'm not going to do anything that affects your standing without telling you first. He was quiet for a moment. What are you going to say? He asked. I'm going to tell her that I appreciate her concern that my employment arrangement is legal and properly documented, that my welfare is my own to manage, and that I will be staying. That's everything she doesn't want to hear, Jacob said. Yes, Clara said. It is. He held her gaze. Tell her, he said, plainly. She wrote the letter that evening at the kitchen table. It was shorter than Eleanor's one paragraph, the same 3 points she had outlined to Jacob, and nothing else. No warmth, no hostility, no performance, just the facts. She addressed the envelope in her own handwriting, which was nothing like Eleanor's small and neat and entirely undecorated, and set it by the door to go into town with Jacob the following morning. He took it without asking what was inside. That, too, meant something. The response from Willow Creek was not immediate, which was somehow worse than if it had been fast. A slow response meant organization. It meant the people who had decided Clara Bennett's presence at Walker Ranch was a problem were taking the time to coordinate, and coordinated opposition was always more dangerous than reactive outrage. She found out the shape of the opposition from an unexpected source. It was young Henry Briggs who told her, the 16-year-old son of a farmer whose land bordered Jacob's on the eastern side. Henry had been coming around the ranch for 2 weeks now, ostensibly to ask Jacob about cattle prices, which was transparently an excuse to watch Clara work with the horses. He was a quiet boy with a gift for stillness that made the animals accept him, and Clara had started letting him help with the afternoon feeding. He arrived on a Thursday, looking like he'd been carrying something heavy and needed to put it down. Miss Bennett, he said. He waited until Jacob was out of earshot. I heard something in town yesterday. All right, she said. My mother was at the dry goods store, he said. Mrs. Hayes was there. She and some of the other women there talking about going to the county commissioner. Not just the town council, the county commissioner directly. Clara kept her hands moving on the water trough she was cleaning. What are they asking for? She said. Henry shifted his weight. Something about a moral ordinance, he said. They want to make it an official county matter, so it can't just be ignored." He paused. "Miss Bennett, my mother came home and told my father, and he said it's getting serious." She looked at him. "Thank you, Henry," she said, "for telling me." He nodded clearly, relieved to have delivered the information and uncertain what to do with the relief. "The horses are looking real good," he said, because he was 16 and horses were safer ground. "They are," she said, "thanks to you helping with the afternoon feed." He went slightly pink and went to find a brush. Clara finished the trough and stood up and looked at nothing for a moment. The county commissioner was a man named Harlan Voss, who had held the position for 11 years and ran it with the particular combination of propriety and self-interest that characterized small county politics everywhere. He was not, as far as Clara knew, a man with any strong feeling about her specifically. But he was a man who cared about how things looked, which made him exactly the kind of person Eleanor Hayes knew how to use. She needed to tell Jacob. Tonight. She told him at supper, and she told him everything she knew, which wasn't much, but was enough. He listened the whole way through without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The employment contract won't be enough." "No," she said, "not for a county commissioner. He'll want it to look a certain way." Jacob's voice was flat and analytical, which was the register he used when he was working through a problem. "He'll want to be able to tell people he took action, that the complaint was heard." "Which means he'll ask you to dismiss me," Clara said. Jacob looked at her steadily. "Yes," he said. She held that for a moment. "And if he does," she said. "Then I'll tell him no," Jacob said. "And I'll tell him why, in public if that's what it takes." She felt something move through her chest, not quite relief, not quite gratitude, something more complicated than either. Something that involved the careful architecture she'd spent years building around herself. The architecture that kept her upright and functional, but had required as its foundation the assumption that she was essentially alone in the world. That architecture was taking some stress she hadn't anticipated. "Jacob," she said carefully. "Clara, that will cost you something. Publicly opposing the commissioner people have long memories in small counties." "I know. It could affect your business, the cattle contracts, the relationships you've spent years." "I know," he said again. He leaned forward slightly. "Do you think I don't know what it costs?" he said. "I've been calculating costs for 3 years. Everything I do, everything I don't do, I run the numbers. I know exactly what this will cost." He paused. "I also know what it costs to do nothing, and that's the number that matters." She looked at him for a long time. "You don't owe me that," she said. "No," he said. "I don't." And then quietly, "I want to." The weight of those 3 words landed differently than she expected. She had been braced for something larger, something with more ceremony to it. But Jacob Walker expressed himself the way he did everything directly economically, without flourish. "I want to." 3 words that contained, "if you knew how to listen." Everything he was not quite ready to say plainly. She knew how to listen. She looked down at her plate. "Thank you," she said. He said nothing more. He didn't need to. The commissioner's visit happened on a Friday, 12 days after Henry Briggs's warning. Harlan Voss arrived at the ranch in a good buggy, with a county seal on the door, which was the kind of detail that was supposed to communicate authority, and which Clara noted without letting it touch her. He was a heavy-set man in his 50s, with a careful beard and the practiced manner of someone who had spent years managing other people's conflicts without getting personally invested in any of them. He shook Jacob's hand and did not offer his hand to Clara, which told her everything she needed to know about how he had decided this meeting was going to go. He sat in the main room. He had a prepared statement, which he read from a folded paper with the monotone of a man reciting a legal document, because it essentially was one. A formal complaint had been brought before the county by several citizens of Willow Creek, citing concerns about the moral character of the Walker Ranch operation as it currently stood, and it was Commissioner Voss's obligation to investigate, and if necessary, recommend a resolution. The recommended resolution, when he finally arrived at it, was exactly what she and Jacob had anticipated. Clara's employment should be terminated. As an act of goodwill toward the county, Jacob would be given 30 days to make alternative arrangements. Jacob sat across from the commissioner with his forearms on his knees and his hands loosely linked, and his face was perfectly still. Clara, sitting to his right, watched Jacob, the way she watched the horses, before a storm, reading the quality of the stillness, interpreting what was underneath it. What was underneath it, she determined, was not anger. It was decision. He had already decided. He had decided before the commissioner arrived, possibly before the second letter. Possibly, she thought, and then stopped the thought because it was too large to hold right now, possibly before the storm. "Mr. Voss," Jacob said. The commissioner looked up from his paper. "I appreciate you making the trip," Jacob said. "I understand this is your obligation, and I want to address the complaint directly." "Of course," Voss said. "Miss Bennett," Jacob said, "is the best ranch hand I've had in 12 years of operation. She found a medical condition in one of my horses that would have cost me a $200 animal. She rebuilt sections of this property that I hadn't had the capacity to address. She manages the livestock with a skill I've seen maybe twice in my career." He paused. "Her employment arrangement is legal documented and witnessed. Her residence on this property is appropriate and private. There is no moral concern here. There is a group of women in Willow Creek who do not like her for reasons that have nothing to do with morality and everything to do with envy." Commissioner Voss shifted in his seat. "Mr. Walker, I understand you're satisfied with the arrangement, but the community standard. Miss Bennett applied for this job the same day those women laughed at her for applying," Jacob said. "She walked 4 miles in July heat because she had the skills and wanted the work. She has been doing that work every single day since. The community standard in question is whether a woman of her abilities deserves to be pushed out of employment she earned by people who find her presence inconvenient." He held the commissioner's gaze. "What is your position on that standard, Mr. Voss?" Harlan Voss was a man who had held his position for 11 years by never being caught without a response. He was quiet for a long 4 seconds. "The complaint was brought by citizens in good standing," he said finally. "I'm sure it was," Jacob said. "And I'm a citizen in good standing who is telling you on the record that this complaint is without merit, and that I will not be dissolving my employment arrangement with Miss Bennett in 30 days or ever. If the county would like to pursue further action, I'll welcome that conversation with an attorney present." The commissioner folded his paper. He looked at Jacob. He looked at Clara for the first time since he'd sat down. Really looked the way you look at someone when you've been actively avoiding seeing them, and finally stop. She met his gaze and held it, and did not look away. "I'll report back to the complainants," he said. "It was not a concession, but it was not an escalation. I trust you understand the situation may not resolve here." "I understand completely," Jacob said. "And I trust you understand mine." Voss stood. Jacob stood. Clara stood. The commissioner left. Jacob closed the door behind him, and for a moment he stood with his hand still on the latch. "He'll go back to Eleanor Hayes," Clara said. "Yes. And she'll push harder." "Probably." Clara looked at him. "You meant every word of that," she said. He turned from the door. "Every single one," he said. Eleanor Hayes came to the ranch herself 3 days later. Clara was not expecting her. None of them were, which she understood was part of the strategy. Eleanor arrived in the mid-afternoon on a Tuesday, when she might reasonably expect to find Clara alone, because Jacob had ridden out to the eastern pasture after the noon meal and typically didn't return until early evening. What Eleanor had not accounted for was Henry Briggs, who had been at the ranch since morning, helping with the horses, and who saw Eleanor's buggy coming up the road from the gate and immediately went to find Clara. "That Mrs. Hayes is coming," he said. Clara straightened up from the feed bin. "Thank you, Henry," she said. "Would you stay close to the barn, please?" He looked at her. "You sure?" "Yes," she said. "Just stay within earshot." He nodded and went. Clara walked to the front yard. Eleanor arrived the way she always arrived anywhere, with the forward momentum of someone who had decided before they left the house how the interaction was going to go. She stepped down from the buggy without waiting for help and walked toward Clara with the kind of brisk, purposeful energy that was supposed to communicate authority. She stopped 5 feet away. "Clara," she said. "Mrs. Hayes," Clara said. Eleanor looked at her. Really looked with the sharp focus of a woman taking inventory. Clara was wearing her work clothes, canvas trousers, the long-sleeved shirt, her hair braided back. She was standing in the yard of a working ranch on a hot Tuesday afternoon, having come directly from the feed bin, and she did not look like someone who had been diminished by it. She looked. Eleanor's expression suggested like someone who had grown, and Eleanor had not prepared for this specific development. "You received my letter," Eleanor said. "I did." "And your response was?" Eleanor paused. "Terse." "It said what I needed it to say," Clara said. "Clara." Eleanor's voice shifted into that register, the concerned register, the one that sounded almost caring and was the most dangerous. "I came here because I'm genuinely worried about you. Whatever you think of me, I want you to hear that." "I hear it," Clara said. "This situation, the commissioner, the council, the talk in town, this is only going to escalate. And when it does, it will be your reputation that suffers, not his. That is how these things work, and I think you know that." "I do know that," Clara said. "That is how these things usually work." "Then you understand." "I understand that the pattern you're describing is real," Clara said. "I understand that women in my position have been forced out of situations like this in counties like this by exactly this kind of coordinated pressure for as long as there have been small counties. I understand that it works." She paused. "I also understand that the reason it works is because the women it's used against believe they don't deserve to fight it." Eleanor blinked. "That's not—" "Mrs. Hayes," Clara said quietly. "What exactly do you want?" Eleanor stopped. "What do I want?" "What is the actual outcome you are trying to achieve?" Clara said. "Not the moral ordinance, not the reputation concern. What do you want for me specifically?" Eleanor's jaw was tight. "I want you to understand your place," she said. And the moment it left her mouth, something shifted as though she'd heard herself say it out loud for the first time, stripped of all the language she usually wrapped around it, and the nakedness of the thing surprised even her. The yard was very quiet. "I know my place," Clara said. "My place is here." Eleanor opened her mouth. "No." Clara said, not loudly, not harshly, but with a firmness that stopped Eleanor cold. "I know you've spent 4 years being certain about what I am and what I deserve. I know you believe it, but I am telling you standing here in front of you that you are wrong. You have been wrong about me since the first day you looked at me and saw something less than what I am. And I am not leaving this ranch to make your wrongness more comfortable." Eleanor stood very still. "You don't know what you're starting," she said. "Yes, I do," Clara said. "I do know, and I'm not afraid of it." A long pause. "That cowboy is not going to marry you," Eleanor said. It was the thing she had held in reserve, the weapon she'd been waiting to use, the most personal cruelty, the one aimed directly at the specific hope she assumed Clara was here for. "Whatever you're thinking, whatever you imagine is happening between you and Jacob Walker, I want you to understand that men like him do not end up with women like you. They feel sorry for them, they use them, and when something better comes along—" "Mrs. Hayes!" The voice came from behind Clara. Both women turned. Jacob Walker was standing at the corner of the house. He had come back from the eastern pasture early. She didn't know why, didn't know if it was instinct or chance, or Henry Briggs somehow finding a way to signal him, but he was there, and he had been there long enough. The look on his face was not fury. It was something colder and more deliberate than fury. He walked forward. He stopped beside Clara, not behind her, beside her. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, "I think you've said what you came to say." Eleanor's face had gone through several rapid adjustments and was now attempting something that resembled composure. "Mr. Walker," she said, "I was speaking to Clara." "I heard what you were saying to Clara," he said. "I've heard enough." He held Eleanor's gaze with the steady attention of a man who had managed 3,000 head of cattle across 2 states and was not impressed by any opponent that stayed on 2 legs. "I want you to hear something from me directly, so there's no confusion about my position." Eleanor said nothing. "Miss Bennett is not here because I feel sorry for her. Jacob said. "She is not here because I used her. She is here because she is the most capable person who has ever worked on this property, and because she earned her place on this ranch through her own work and her own character, and because I value her judgment more than I value the opinion of anyone in Willow Creek." He paused. "Including yours." Eleanor looked at Clara. Clara looked back. "Furthermore," Jacob said, "if you or the council or Commissioner Voss or anyone else in this county takes any action, formal or informal, that damages Miss Bennett's standing or her livelihood, I will respond through every legal channel available to me. And I have the resources to make that a very long and very public process." Eleanor Hayes stood in the yard of Walker Ranch in the afternoon sun, and for the first time in Clara's memory, she had nothing to say. She turned. She walked to her buggy. She gathered her reins and drove down the road toward Willow Creek, and Clara watched the buggy go without moving. When it was gone, she turned to Jacob. He was looking at her with that open quality again, the expression that cost him something to show. She could see the exertion of it, the way it sat on his face against the grain of his natural reserve. "Are you all right?" he asked. She thought about Eleanor's face when she'd said, "I know my place." She thought about Eleanor's weapon. Men like him do not end up with women like you, and the way it had landed, and the way she had chosen to let it pass through instead of letting it stick. She thought about Jacob standing beside her, not behind, beside. "Yes," she said. "I'm all right." He nodded. They stood for a moment. "I came back early," he said. "I noticed. Henry found me at the east fence." He paused. "Smart kid." "He is," she said. Another pause. "Clara." He stopped, started again. What Eleanor said, about, "You don't need to respond to it," she said. "I want to." She looked at him. "What I said out there," he said carefully, "about your judgment, your character, your place on this ranch." He held her gaze. "I meant that apart from anything else. I want you to know I meant it exactly as I said it, and not as a performance for her benefit." She felt the careful architecture inside her take another hit of unanticipated stress. "I know," she said. "I heard it that way." He exhaled slowly. "Good," he said. And then from the barn, clearly deciding the dramatic pause had gone on long enough, Dust let out a noise that was approximately 80% complaint and 20% personality. And Clara laughed. Actually laughed, a real one, the kind that comes from somewhere unguarded. Jacob looked startled. Then the corner of his mouth moved. "He wants his afternoon feed," Clara said. "He always wants his afternoon feed," Jacob said. She walked toward the barn. After a beat, he followed. Behind them, the road to Willow Creek was empty and still. And above the ranch, the sky was going gold at the edges, and Clara Bennett walked into the barn she had helped build, back into something whole, and went to feed the horse who had once let no one near him, and she was not afraid of what was coming. She was ready for it. Eleanor Hayes drove back to Willow Creek in silence, and that silence was louder than anything she had said in the yard. Clara knew with the certainty of someone who had studied Eleanor for 4 years that the silence would not last. People like Eleanor Hayes did not absorb defeats, they converted them. They took the humiliation of being outmaneuvered, and they refined it into something harder and more focused, and then they came back with it. The only question was the shape it would take. She didn't have to wait long to find out. The shape it took was Robert Kane. She heard the name for the first time from Henry Briggs, who arrived at the ranch on a Monday morning with the tight, careful expression of someone carrying bad news and trying to figure out how to set it down without making a mess. "There's a man in town," Henry said. He waited until Jacob had gone to the north pasture. "Arrived Saturday. He's been staying at the hotel. My father says he's a land attorney from Helena." Clara went still. "What kind of land attorney?" she said. "The kind that Mrs. Hayes had supper with on Saturday night," Henry said, "and again on Sunday." Clara set down the feed scoop. "Does your father know who he's representing?" "Not officially," Henry said. "But he overheard something at the hardware store." Henry looked uncomfortable. "Miss Bennett, they're saying there's a question about the title to this land. Something about the original filing from when Mr. Walker first bought the property. She looked at Henry. The title, she said. Yes, ma'am. She understood immediately. This was not about the moral ordinance anymore. Eleanor Hayes had shifted the ground entirely. A title dispute was not a matter of community opinion or county commissioners. It was a matter of law, of courts, of money and time, and the kind of slow grinding pressure that could destroy a man's livelihood while he was still standing in the field, thinking he was winning. Thank you, Henry, she said. Go ahead and start on the morning feed. She went to find Jacob. She found him at the north fence, and she told him plainly, the way she told him everything, the facts first. Then what she thought it meant, then what she thought they should do. He listened without moving, which was the Jacob Walker version of paying complete attention. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. My title is clean, he said finally. I know it is. I filed it correctly in '72 and had it reviewed twice, once when I refinanced the cattle operation and once when I was considering selling the eastern parcel. I know, she said. But a challenge doesn't have to be valid to be expensive. It just has to be filed. He looked at her. They're not trying to take the land, she said. They're trying to drain you. The legal fees, the time, the uncertainty. They want you distracted and financially stressed, and they want me to feel responsible for it. Jacob's jaw worked. He stopped. Effective, Clara said. It's effective. I won't pretend it isn't. He looked at her steadily. Are you about to tell me you're thinking of leaving? He said. She met his gaze. No, she said. I'm about to tell you we need to go to Helena and get ahead of this before Kane files anything. He blinked. He hadn't expected that. He said. You'll need someone to review the documentation before you sit down with your attorney, she said. I've read your filing records. I found them when I organized the office. I know where the potential pressure points are. He stared at her. You read my land filing records, he said. I organize things thoroughly, she said. I told you that on my first day. He stared at her for one more moment. Then he almost smiled. When do we leave? He said. Tomorrow morning, she said. Early. They rode to Helena. It was a 7-hour ride each way, and they left before dawn and rode mostly in a comfortable silence that had become over the past weeks their natural register. Clara had learned that Jacob thought better when he wasn't talking, and she had learned that her own thinking was cleaner when she wasn't filling space with words. So they rode, and the land opened up around them, and the mountains came closer, and it was the first time Clara had been away from Willow Creek in 3 years. She hadn't realized how much she needed to see a larger horizon until she saw one. Jacob's attorney in Helena was a man named Cornelius Marsh, who had a small office above a bank and a mind like a steel trap covered in wool. He was warm, unhurried, and thoroughly dangerous in the specific way of very competent men who don't look it. He listened to everything they told him. He asked Clara several direct questions about the documentation she had reviewed, and she answered them in the same precise, unsentimental language that he used, and she watched him recalibrate his understanding of who he was dealing with. The same way Dr. Alderman had, the same way Jacob had on the first day. She was getting used to that recalibration. She had decided to let herself feel something when it happened, rather than deflecting it. The title is clean, Marsh said after reviewing the documents Jacob had brought. Entirely clean. Whoever Kane is working for doesn't have a case, but you're right, that he doesn't need one initially. A filed challenge creates a cloud on the title that has to be cleared legally, and that process takes time and money. How much time? Jacob said. Managed aggressively. 3 months. Unmanaged a year. Possibly 2. Jacob looked at Clara. She had already done this math. File preemptively, she said to Marsh. Can you file a declaration of clear title with the court before Kane files his challenge? Marsh looked at her. That's yes, he said slowly. That's exactly what would short-circuit the strategy. It forces Kane to respond to our filing rather than us responding to his. It inverts the burden. How long does that take? Jacob said. I can have it prepared and filed by the end of the week, Marsh said. It won't end the challenge immediately, but it changes the posture entirely. We're no longer on defense. Jacob looked at Clara. She nodded. "Do it," Jacob said. They rode back to the ranch in the late afternoon, and the sky was doing something extraordinary in the west. Colors that had no practical use but existed anyway, purely for the fact of themselves. And Jacob rode beside her, and she could feel him working through something, the way she had learned to feel the quality of his silences. "You knew about the preemptive filing," he said. "I'd read about a similar case in the law review that Marsh keeps in his waiting room," she said. "I read it while you were discussing the fee structure." "You read a law review in the 15 minutes we were waiting," he said. "I read fast," she said. "I told you." He shook his head slowly. They rode for another mile. "Clara," he said. She looked at him. "What I said to Eleanor Hayes," he said. "In the yard." He was looking straight ahead, which was the direction he looked when he was saying something difficult. "About your judgment, your character." "Jacob, you don't—" "I need to say this," he said. She closed her mouth. "Everything I said was true," he said. "And it was also incomplete." He paused. He was working the reins in his hands, a gesture she recognized now as his version of fidgeting, which meant he was genuinely unsettled. "What I did say, because Eleanor Hayes was standing there, and I wasn't going to say it for her benefit. What I didn't say is that this ranch has been alive since you came. Not just repaired, not just functional." He paused again, and alive, the way it was when Margaret was here. She heard Margaret's name, with the weight it carried the fullness of what it meant for him to invoke it. "Jacob," she said softly. "I'm not comparing you to her," he said quickly. "That's not what I mean. Margaret was Margaret. You are entirely yourself. What I mean is that quality of a place being inhabited by someone who cares about it. Really cares. That's been missing for 3 years, and now it isn't, and He stopped. "I don't want it to go away." She held herself very still on horseback. "Are you asking me to stay?" she said. "Yes," he said. "Permanently, not as ranch hand." He finally looked at her. "As partner. Equal share of the operation. Your name on the deed beside mine." Her breath left her slowly. "Jacob," she said. "I have the paperwork," he said. "I had Marsh draw it up this morning while you were reading. Before you ask, that is not a coincidence." She stared at him. "You planned this," she said. "I've been thinking about it for 3 weeks," he said. "The trip gave me the occasion." She looked at the road ahead, then back at him. His face was very careful the way it got when he had committed to something and was waiting to find out the cost. "This is not charity," she said. It wasn't a question. "No," he said. "It is not. And it's not—" She stopped. "It's not pity, or Clara." His voice was steady. "I watched you save a horse with your bare hands and your patience. I watched you go toe-to-toe with Eleanor Hayes and not flinch. I watched you read a law review in 15 minutes and hand my attorney a strategy he hadn't thought of." He held her gaze. "Do I seem like a man who gives things out of pity?" She thought about it seriously. "No," she said. "You don't." "Then take it seriously," he said. "As a serious offer from a serious man." She was quiet for a long stretch of road. The ranch came into view on the horizon, the rebuilt barn, the new fence lines, the pasture where she could just make out dust moving in the early evening light. "Yes," she said. Jacob's shoulders released just slightly, just enough that she caught it. "Yes," he said. "Yes," she said. "I'll take your serious offer seriously." The corner of his mouth moved. They rode home. The paperwork was signed the following week, witnessed by Cornelius Marsh, and notarized by the county clerk in Helena. Clara Bennett's name went onto the deed of Walker Ranch in the same clean, undecorated handwriting she used for everything, and the document went into the safe in Jacob's office, their office now, which she had reorganized in the first week, and which still made Jacob mildly dazed to enter. Marsh sent a copy to Commissioner Voss, not as a formal communication, as a courtesy. It arrived in Voss's office on a Thursday morning. By Thursday afternoon, it had arrived by some mechanism of small county information travel that Clara did not need to understand to predict at Eleanor Hayes's house on the Good Street in Willow Creek. She heard about Eleanor's reaction from Margaret Pruitt, who arrived at the ranch on a Friday afternoon, looking like a woman who had been carrying a stone for a long time and had finally decided to put it down. "May I speak with you?" Margaret asked. Clara looked at her for a moment. "Yes," she said. "Come inside." They sat at the kitchen table. Margaret held her hands in her lap, with the careful posture of a woman constructing her words before she released them. "Eleanor is furious," she said. "I assumed," Clara said. "The Kane strategy is done. Apparently your attorney filed something that blocked it." "Yes." Margaret looked at the table. "She's saying terrible things," she said. "About you, about Jacob, about the arrangement." "I'm sure she is," Clara said. "Clara." Margaret looked up. Her eyes were doing something that looked very much like guilt, which was not an expression Clara had ever seen on Margaret Pruitt's face, and which she found genuinely disorienting. "I need to tell you something. I need to tell you that I've gone along with Eleanor for years. For years. Because it was easier. Because she's powerful in this town, and disagreeing with her costs. You and I've never been. I'm not someone who—" She stopped, started again. "I laughed at you. In the store. On the day you took this job. I laughed, and I didn't say anything when she spoke to you that way, and I've been thinking about it since." The kitchen was very quiet. Clara looked at Margaret Pruitt, this woman she had known for 4 years, who had been unkind by consent, if not by initiation, who had let Eleanor use the social infrastructure they shared to grind Clara down again and again, and had told herself it wasn't her business. "Why are you telling me this now?" Clara asked. Not harshly, genuinely. "Because you stayed," Margaret said. "Because you didn't run. Because—" She paused. "Because my daughter is 14 years old, and she is not small, and she is not what this town considers a conventional beauty, and I watch people treat her the way they've treated you. And I have been telling myself that's just how things are." Her voice broke slightly on the last word. "I don't want to keep telling myself that." Clara was quiet for a moment. "I'm not going to tell you it didn't hurt," Clara said. "It did. It hurt every time." "No," Margaret said. "But I'm not angry at you," Clara said. "I want you to know it's not forgiveness exactly, because I don't think you've done something that requires my formal forgiveness. You've done something harder than that." She paused. "You've looked at yourself and didn't look away." Margaret blinked hard. "Your daughter," Clara said. "What is her name?" "Frances," Margaret said. "Franny. Does Franny like animals?" Margaret looked confused by the shift. "Yes," she said. "She loves animals. She's been going out to the Briggs farm to help with their horses, but Henry's off most days now, and—" "Send her here," Clara said. Margaret stared. "Send her to the ranch," Clara said. "On Saturdays. I'm working with 2 young horses we'll be breaking in the fall, and I need patient hands. Henry can't always make it." She held Margaret's gaze. "Franny can learn real skills here, skills she earned, that nobody can take from her." Margaret's mouth had gone very soft at the edges. "Clara," she said, "you don't have to—" "I know I don't," Clara said. "I want to." Franny Pruitt arrived the following Saturday at 7 in the morning, 15 minutes early, wearing practical clothes that suggested her mother had briefed her thoroughly on what to expect. She was tall for 14, with broad shoulders she hadn't grown into yet, and a way of holding herself slightly inward, that particular posture that came from being told in 100 small ways that you took up too much space. Clara recognized it immediately. She took Franny to the pasture first and introduced her to Ada. Franny approached the fence with the careful uncertainty of someone who wanted very much to do the right thing and wasn't sure what the right thing was. "Don't approach her yet," Clara said. "Just stand here." "How long?" Franny asked. "Until she comes to you," Clara said. Franny looked at her. "She'll come to me," she said. She sounded like she was deciding whether to believe it. "If you let her," Clara said. "You don't go to her. You let her decide." Franny turned back to the fence. She stood very still. Ada grazed for several minutes without appearing to notice them, which was not true. Ada noticed everything, which Clara knew, but 14-year-old Franny needed to learn that patience was not the same as being ignored. Then Ada raised her head, looked at Franny directly, and walked over. She pressed her nose into Franny's hand. Franny made a sound, not a word, just a breath that broke open slightly in the middle, and her hand came up and she stroked Ada's nose with a gentleness that was entirely instinctive and entirely right. She looked back at Clara with an expression that Clara had not seen on a 14-year-old face in a very long time. It was the expression of someone discovering for the first time that they were capable of something. "She likes me," Franny said. "Yes," Clara said. "She does." "Why?" "Because you let her choose," Clara said. "She chose you." Franny looked back at Ada. Her shoulders had dropped about 3 inches from where they'd been when she walked in. Clara left her there and went to find Jacob, who was watching from the other side of the fence with his arms folded on the rail and an expression that she had learned to read accurately. "You're going to do this every Saturday," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," she said. "If you don't mind." "I don't mind," he said. She leaned against the fence beside him. From inside the pasture, Franny was talking to Ada in a low voice, the private language people used with animals when they thought no one was listening. "I had a conversation with Voss yesterday," Jacob said. She looked at him. "He called it a courtesy call," Jacob said. "He wanted to let me know that the council complaint has been formally withdrawn, as of Monday." Clara was very still. "Withdrawn," she said. "Eleanor pushed for a county vote and didn't get the support she needed," Jacob said. "Apparently 3 of the 5 council members declined to pursue it. 2 of them cited the title documentation as evidence that the operation is a legitimate business partnership." He paused. "And 1 of them cited something else." "What?" she said. "Dr. Alderman spoke at the council meeting," Jacob said. "He wasn't asked. He simply appeared, and he told them that Miss Clara Bennett had saved a horse worth $200 through direct skill and attention, and that she had managed a complex rehabilitation program that he himself would have been proud of, and that any county that ran a woman of her ability out of legitimate employment was a county that deserved to fail at agriculture." Clara stared. "He said that," she said. "Those were apparently his exact words," Jacob said. "According to Voss." She looked at the pasture, where Franny was still talking to Ada. She thought about Dr. Alderman arriving uninvited at a county council meeting to defend her. She thought about Henry Briggs riding out to find Jacob at the east fence. She thought about Margaret Pruitt sitting at the kitchen table with her hands in her lap and guilt on her face. She thought about the general architecture of what was happening. Not just the legal victory, not just the withdrawn complaint, but the wider thing, the shape of it. "Jacob," she said. "Something is shifting," she said. He looked at her sideways. "Yes," he said. "Not just for us," she said. "For the town." He was quiet. "I know," he said. She looked at Franny Pruitt's changed posture in the pasture and thought about the specific quiet power of a choice being witnessed. How it spread. How it told other people that a choice was possible. She had not come to Walker Ranch to change anything. She had come to do the work. But the work, it turned out, was not only the barn and the horses and the fence lines. The work was also this. It was 2 weeks later that Eleanor Hayes came back to the ranch. Clara was alone in the yard. Jacob had ridden to town. Franny had gone home an hour earlier. Henry had left mid-afternoon. The timing was not accidental, which Clara understood the moment she saw Eleanor's buggy on the road. She waited in the yard. Eleanor stepped down from the buggy. She looked different, not diminished. Eleanor Hayes would not permit herself to look diminished, but altered in some way that Clara needed a moment to identify. Then she identified it. Eleanor looked tired. Not the tiredness of physical labor, which Eleanor had carefully avoided her entire life, but something older and harder to remedy. The tiredness that came from expending tremendous energy in the service of a story that was collapsing under its own weight. She stopped in front of Clara. They looked at each other. "The council vote," Eleanor said. "Yes," Clara said. "Cain has returned to Helena." "I know." Eleanor looked at the barn. The fence, the pasture where Ada and Dust moved peacefully. Her face moved through something that was not quite readable, not quite nameable. "You've done a great deal here," she said. Her voice was stripped of the concerned register, stripped of the performance. It was just a voice. "Yes," Clara said. "The horses look well," Eleanor said. "They are well." A silence. "I have a granddaughter," Eleanor said. "She's 9. Her name is Pearl." She paused. She's a large child, for her age. Her mother worries." Clara looked at her. Eleanor did not look away. "Frances Pruitt has been speaking about the ranch," Eleanor said, in a way that— She stopped. Pearl heard her. The yard was very quiet. "Does Pearl like horses?" Clara asked. Eleanor's throat worked. "She hasn't been near one," she said, "but she asks about them." Clara looked at this woman who had spent 4 years whittling her down in small, precise ways, who had sent her to this ranch as a joke and had spent 3 months trying to drive her back out, who was standing in front of her now in the afternoon sun talking about a 9-year-old child named Pearl who was large for her age and whose mother worried. "Bring her on a Saturday," Clara said. "Franny will be here. They can work together." Eleanor blinked. "Why would you—" She stopped. "Because Pearl is 9 years old," Clara said, "and she doesn't have anything to do with what's between you and me." Eleanor stood very still. Something in her face broke open in a way that Clara suspected had not happened in a very long time, and Eleanor Hayes, who was not a person who cried in front of anyone, turned her face away and pressed her lips together hard. After a moment, she turned back. "I was cruel to you," Eleanor said. Flat, direct, without the clothing of justification. "Yes," Clara said. "I told myself it wasn't—" She stopped. "I told myself various things." "I know," Clara said. "They weren't true," Eleanor said. "No," Clara said. "They weren't." Another silence longer than the ones before it. "I'll bring Pearl on Saturday," Eleanor said, "if the offer stands." "It stands," Clara said. Eleanor nodded once. She turned back to her buggy and gathered her reins and drove away, and Clara stood in the yard and watched her go. She stood there for a while after the buggy had disappeared. She was thinking about the exact moment when a story stops, being the story it was, and becomes something different. Not the dramatic breaking point, not the moment of open confrontation, but the quiet one after. The moment when the person who hurt you shows up carrying something fragile, and you have to decide what to do with the power of being the one who is asked. She had not decided to forgive Eleanor Hayes. Forgiveness was a complicated thing that she was not going to rush, but she had decided to let Pearl come on Saturday. That was enough for now. That was, she thought, the kind of enough that became something larger over time. Jacob came home in the early evening and found her on the porch. He tied his horse and came up and sat beside her in the other chair, and she told him about Eleanor's visit. He listened. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You told her to bring the granddaughter," he said. "Yes." "Even after everything?" "Even after everything," she said. "The girl is 9. The girl didn't do anything." He looked at her profile. "Clara," he said. She turned. His face was doing the open thing again, the thing she had learned to recognize as Jacob Walker at the full extent of his emotional range, which was not small, only held very carefully. "I need to tell you something," he said. She waited. "I have spent 3 years," he said, "telling myself that this place was enough. The land, the horses, the work. That was enough, and I didn't need—" He stopped. "That was a lie I told myself because the truth was too large, and I wasn't ready for it." She did not move. "The truth," he said, "is that a place is not a home. It's just land." He held her gaze. "You made this a home. You walked 4 miles in July heat, and you fixed my barn, and you saved my horses, and you stood in this yard, and faced down Eleanor Hayes, and you sat at my kitchen table, and listened to me talk about Margaret, and you never made me feel like my grief was something I needed to be finished with before I could be worth talking to." Her throat was very tight. "Jacob," she said, I know the partnership paper is signed, he said. I know you're staying. I know all of that is settled. He paused. I'm saying something different. She looked at him. He looked back at her with all of his cards on the table. This man who had spent 3 years in careful self-imposed exile. This man who moved deliberately and spoke plainly and had built something real with his hands and then watched grief take it apart and had not fully understood until recently that something could be built again. I'm saying, he said carefully, that I love you. Not as a partner. As the person I want to be on this porch with. He exhaled. I have not said those words to another person since Margaret. I want you to know the weight of them when I say them. She knew the weight of them. She had known for longer than she was comfortable admitting that this conversation was coming. She had felt it building the way she felt weather as a shift in pressure, as a particular quality in the air. She had also spent a significant amount of time arguing with herself about whether she was allowed to want this. Whether a woman who had been told in 1,000 different ways that she was not the kind of woman who ended up with this kind of life was entitled to believe that the message had been wrong all along. She had decided sometime in the last 3 weeks that the message had been wrong all along. I love you too, she said. I have been aware of it for some time, and I wasn't sure whether to say so. He let out a breath. Why weren't you sure? He said. Because I didn't want you to feel... She stopped. Because Eleanor Hayes's voice is unfortunately still in my head from time to time, and her voice says, Don't, he said, not harshly, quietly, firmly. Don't let her voice live in this conversation. She doesn't belong here. Clara looked at him. No, she said. She doesn't. He reached out and took her hand, which was the most physical gesture he had made toward her in all their weeks together, and he held it with the same deliberate care he used for everything. And she felt the warmth of it move all the way through her, like something returning from a long distance. They sat on the porch of Walker Ranch as the last of the daylight went gold, and then pink, and then the particular blue of Montana dusk, and they held hands in the quiet, and the horses moved in the pasture, and inside the house the lamp was lit, and the stove was warm, and the name on the deed had 2 parts now. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was home. Pearl Hayes arrived the following Saturday at 8 in the morning, standing behind her grandmother's leg, like a girl who had been told to be brave and was working hard at it. She was 9 years old, and she was large for her age, solidly built with Eleanor's dark eyes and a chin that already suggested she would eventually have Eleanor's stubbornness, though, with any luck she would find better uses for it. She held a small straw hat in both hands and turned it in a slow, continuous circle, which was what nervous people did when they needed something to do with their hands. Clara crouched down, not to seem smaller, not as a performance of gentleness. She crouched because you talked to a 9-year-old at a 9-year-old's level, if you wanted the 9-year-old to believe you were actually talking to her. Pearl, she said. Pearl looked at her. Have you ever been near a horse before? Clara asked. No, ma'am, Pearl said. Very quiet, very careful. Are you scared? A pause. Pearl glanced up at Eleanor, then back at Clara. A little, she admitted. Good, Clara said. Pearl blinked. Being a little scared means you're paying attention, Clara said. That's useful around horses. The people who get hurt are usually the ones who aren't scared enough to pay attention. Pearl absorbed this with the focused seriousness of a child filing away information she intends to use. Come with me, Clara said and stood up. Pearl followed. Eleanor stayed at the fence. Clara took Pearl to Ada first, the same way she had taken Franny, and she stood beside Pearl and gave her the same instruction. Don't go to her. Let her come to you. And Pearl, who had just been told that her nervous attention was an asset rather than a liability, stood very still with her small hat held at her side and waited. Franny was already in the pasture working with dust on a long lead line, and she looked over at Pearl and gave her a nod that was meant to be encouraging, and mostly succeeded. Ada came to Pearl in 4 minutes. It had taken Franny 11. When Ada's nose pressed into Pearl's outstretched hand, the child went absolutely rigid for 1 second, the full body freeze of someone receiving more than they expected, and then released all at once. Laughing, a genuine, uncontrolled laugh that came from somewhere she hadn't been trying to access. Clara heard Eleanor behind her at the fence make a sound. She did not turn around. She kept her eyes on Pearl, who was now talking to Ada in the low private voice that was apparently universal, the language everyone found when they stopped worrying about being overheard. "She has a gift," Clara said, still not turning. "She doesn't," Eleanor started. Stopped. Tried again. "People don't usually say that about her." "What do people usually say?" Clara said. A long pause. "That she's a lot," Eleanor said quietly. "Too much. Too loud. Too big. Too—" She stopped again. Clara turned around now. She looked at Eleanor Hayes, who was gripping the fence rail with both hands and watching her granddaughter laugh with a horse, and whose face was doing something entirely private that Clara had never seen on it before. "She's exactly enough," Clara said. Eleanor looked at her. "Pearl is exactly enough," Clara said. "Exactly as she is. And if the people in her life keep telling her she's too much, she's going to spend the next 20 years making herself smaller. And she'll be very good at it. And she'll lose something she won't be able to name." Eleanor's jaw was very tight. "I know," she said. It came out barely above a whisper. "Do right by her," Clara said. Simply, without accusation. Eleanor looked back at Pearl. "I intend to," she said. Jacob watched all of this from the barn doorway. He had been doing something with the tack. There was always something with the tack, and he had positioned himself where he could observe the pasture without appearing to observe it, which Clara had long since identified as a Jacob Walker specialty. He was a man who paid close attention to things and preferred that his attention not be noticed. She walked over to him when Pearl and Franny were settled into a lesson together. "Eleanor Hayes is watching her granddaughter learn something," she said. "I see that," Jacob said. "She looks different," Clara said. "People look different when something they thought was permanent turns out not to be," Jacob said. She looked at him. "Speaking from experience," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. "Extensively," he said. She leaned against the doorframe beside him, and they watched Pearl and Franny together in the pasture. And Dust put his head over Franny's shoulder, the way he had started doing, and Ada stood patient and immovable, while Pearl learned where to put her hands, and it was the kind of morning that felt like it was doing something beyond itself, like it was practicing for the future. "I've been thinking about the breeding program," Clara said. Jacob looked at her sideways. "Already? I've been thinking about it for 6 weeks, she said. "I didn't want to bring it up while we were managing everything else. But now that the legal situation is settled, and we have a functioning operation." "You want to expand," he said. "Selectively," she said. "Quarter horses specifically. There's a market in the territory for well-trained working horses that isn't being served. Dr. Alderman knows 3 ranchers who've asked him directly who he'd recommend for a breeding program. He mentioned our names." Jacob was quiet. "He mentioned our names," he said. "He mentioned Walker Ranch," she said. "Both our names on the deed." Jacob absorbed that. "How long before the first foals would be ready to work?" he said. 3 years handled correctly," she said. "Which means we'd need to be selective about the breeding stock now. I've been looking at—" "Clara," he said. She stopped. He was looking at her with an expression she recognized, the full attention, the quality of it. "You've been building this plan in your head for 6 weeks, he said. "Yes." "While managing the barn repairs and the legal situation and the horses and Franny's training and apparently now Pearl." "The days are long," she said. He shook his head. "Show me the plan," he said. "Tonight," she said. "I have it in the notebook." "Tonight," he agreed. He went back to the tack, and she went back to the pasture, and neither of them said anything more about it, because they had both long since learned that with each other the conversation wasn't over just because the words stopped. The breeding program conversation that night at the kitchen table lasted 3 hours. Clara had this notebook, the same small ledger she had brought on the first day, now dense with observations and calculations on every 3rd page, and she walked Jacob through the market analysis, the bloodline considerations, the timeline and the capital requirements, with the same precision she brought to every other problem she had handed him since the first morning. He asked questions, good ones. The kind that came from someone who understood the territory and the cattle trade and the particular economics of the region, and was applying all of that to what she was telling him, not just deferring to her because she had the notebook. She liked that. She had always liked that about him, that he engaged rather than accepted. At some point near midnight, they had moved from market analysis to specific bloodlines to the question of which neighboring ranchers might be interested in a partnership arrangement for the first breeding season. And Jacob had pulled out his own notes from the desk, handwritten lists of contacts and relationships and standing agreements, and the two sets of notes were spread across the table together, overlapping, and somewhere in that overlap was the shape of the next chapter of Walker Ranch. "Hendrick's up in the Bitterroot Valley," Jacob said. "He's been looking for quality quarter horse stock for 2 years. I can reach out next week." "And the McGrath family over in Cascade," Clara said. Dr. Alderman mentioned them specifically. "I know Tom McGrath," Jacob said. "He's straightforward, fair." "Good," she said. Jacob leaned back in his chair and looked at the table covered in their combined notes. "6 months ago," he said. "This ranch was losing ground every week. I knew it and I couldn't." He paused. "I could see it happening and I didn't have enough left in me to stop it." She looked at him. "And now," she said. He looked at her across the table. "Now I'm up at midnight planning a breeding program," he said, "with my partner." He said the word with a weight that contained everything he had put into it. The deed, the conversation on the porch, the 3 years before she arrived. "And I cannot think of a single thing I would rather be doing." She felt warmth move through her that had nothing to do with the stove. "Neither can I," she said. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, briefly. The same gesture as the porch, that careful warmth. And then he pulled it back and looked at the notes. Because he was Jacob Walker, and even the most tender moments in his life had a practical quality to them that she had come to love specifically. "The Hendricks letter," he said. "You should write it." "You know him better," she said. "He needs to know who he's dealing with from the start," Jacob said. "And who he's dealing with is you. Write the letter." She picked up her pen. She wrote the letter. The summer turned, and with it something in Willow Creek turned too. It was not dramatic. It was not a single moment. It was the accumulation of small things that eventually reached a mass that could not be ignored. Dr. Alderman's speech to the county council had traveled as speeches do in small territories far beyond the room where it was given. 3 ranching families in adjacent counties had heard some version of it by August. 2 of them sent inquiries to Walker Ranch about the horse training program. One of them sent his wife and daughter to meet Clara directly, and the wife a practical woman from Nebraska named Ruth Calloway, who had no patience for social performance of any kind. Spent 4 hours at the ranch, watched Clara work with the horses, asked 17 direct questions, and went home and told her husband that Walker Ranch was the real thing. The Calloway contract was signed in September. It was the first outside contract the ranch had ever held. When the paperwork arrived, Jacob set it on the kitchen table and looked at Clara and said, "Marsh should add a line to your deed section." She looked at the contract. "What line?" she said. "Principal trainer," he said. "That's what Ruth Calloway hired. That's what the contract should say." She looked at him. "Jacob," she said. "It's accurate," he said. "Is it not accurate?" She looked at the contract. "Yes," she said. "It's accurate." "Then it goes in," he said. She wrote to Marsh that afternoon. Henry Briggs turned 17 in October and asked with the carefully prepared casualness of someone who had been working up to a question for weeks whether there might be a paid position at Walker Ranch come spring. Jacob looked at Clara. Clara looked at Henry. "You'd be working under me," she said. "My training program, my methods, my schedule." "Yes, ma'am," Henry said. He was trying not to look as eager as he was and failing completely. "The pay is fair," she said. "Not generous. Fair." "That's all I'm asking for," Henry said. "And you'll be taking instruction from a woman," she said. "Every day, without qualification." Henry looked at her steadily. "Miss Bennett," he said, "you're the best horse person I've ever seen. I don't care what you are. I care what you know." She held his gaze for a moment. Start in March, she said, when the ground thaws. Henry's whole face changed. Thank you, he said. Miss Bennett, Mr. Walker, thank you. Jacob shook his hand. Henry rode home in the late afternoon, and Jacob watched him go and said, "He's going to be good." "Yes," Clara said. "He is." "You knew that from the first week," Jacob said. "Yes," she said. "I did." He shook his head slowly, the particular slow headshake she had catalogued as his version of something that in another man might be expressed with more words. She had translated it approximately as "You are remarkable, and I am still getting used to it." The first snow came early that year, November, a real one, the kind that settled in and meant it. The ranch went into winter mode, which was a different rhythm from summer, slower in some ways and more demanding in others, and Clara learned it the way she had learned everything about the ranch, by paying attention and asking questions and not pretending she knew things she didn't. Jacob was a different person in winter. Not worse different. More interior. The natural introversion that summer work held at bay came forward in the shorter days, and she learned to read that too. Learned when to push into conversation and when to let the silence do its work. She learned that he liked to read at night by the fire history, mostly the kind with battles and decisions and consequences. She learned that he made coffee too strong in cold weather, a habit so consistent she suspected it was emotional rather than practical. She learned that the anniversary of Margaret's death in December was a day he needed to spend mostly in the barn, and she learned not to follow him there or to fill the evening with distraction, but to have a meal ready when he came in and to sit with him and let the grief be what it was without trying to replace it. He told her on one of those December evenings that she was the first person who had ever understood that. Everyone else wanted to fix it, he said, or replace it, or tell me it was time to move past it. Grief doesn't move past, she said. It just changes shape. He looked at her. You've lost someone, he said. My mother, she said, when I was 16, and my uncle 2 years later. She paused. And a version of myself that I think I mourned for a very long time without knowing I was doing it. He was very still. What version? He said. She thought about how to say it. The version that believed she was what people said she was, Clara said. The girl who was grateful for whatever scraps of belonging she could get, who stacked flour sacks and smiled at people who didn't smile back and told herself that was enough. She paused. Mourning that version of yourself is strange. You have to grieve her and be glad she's gone at the same time. Jacob was quiet for a long moment. She got you here, he said finally. Clara looked at him. That version of you, he said. She was the one who picked up that notice. She was the one who walked the 4 miles. He held her gaze. I don't think you should be entirely glad she's gone. Clara felt something shift in her chest. She had not thought about it that way. She had been so focused on the distance she had traveled from that girl, the stacked flour sacks, the careful invisibility, the survival-level existence, that she had not stopped to consider that the girl had also been the one with enough left in her to reach for something different. That the endurance and the dignity had been there all along, waiting. No, she said quietly. I suppose I shouldn't. He reached over and took her hand. They sat by the fire while the snow came down outside, and the horses were warm in the barn, and the ranch held them both in its solid, rebuilt, renamed self. The twist that winter arrived in the form of a letter from Helena that was not from Cornelius Marsh. It was from a woman named Genevieve Alderman, the veterinarian's wife. As it turned out, though, Clara had not known he was married, which said something about how little she had thought to ask about the personal lives of people who had helped her. Genevieve Alderman was, the letter explained, the secretary of the Montana Women's Agricultural Society, a 4-year-old organization with 43 members across the territory. And she was writing because her husband had spoken about Clara Bennett at their dinner table so many times that Genevieve had finally decided to make direct contact. The society was looking for someone to speak at their spring gathering in Helena. About horse training. About running a working ranch. About the practical and legal realities of women holding property and partnership agreements in the territory. Clara read the letter 3 times. Then she handed it to Jacob. He read it once. "You're going to say yes," he said. "I'm thinking about it," she said. "You're going to say yes," he said. "Jacob." "Clara." He set the letter down. 43 women across this territory, and probably more who don't know the society exists yet, who are trying to do the same kind of thing you did. Who are looking at situations like yours, was the legal questions, the property rights, the community opposition, and they don't have anyone who has been through it and come out the other side to tell them it's possible. He held her gaze. "You're going to say yes." She looked at the letter. "I've never spoken in front of a group," she said. "You spoke in front of the general store," he said. "You spoke in front of the commissioner. You spoke in front of Eleanor Hayes." He paused. "You've been speaking in front of groups your whole life. The groups were just hostile." She looked at him. Something in her chest which had been wound tight from the moment she opened the envelope released. "A friendly audience might actually be harder," she said. "Yes," he said. "Probably." She wrote to Genevieve Alderman that evening. The letter was one paragraph. It said yes. Spring came to Walker Ranch, the way. Spring always came to Montana, not gently, not gradually, but as a decision. The land made all at once, the snow retreating in a single week, and the grass coming up behind it with the specific urgency of things that have been waiting. Henry Briggs arrived on the first Monday of March as promised, and he was met by 2 horses in training. A long list of tasks in Clara's notebook, and Franny Pruitt, who had appointed herself unofficial senior assistant over the winter and was not shy about it. Henry and Franny, became apparent within the first week, were going to argue about everything. They argued about lead line technique and feeding schedules and the correct way to store saddle blankets and whether Ada or Dust had the better temperament for working with beginners. They argued with the focused energy of people who were both right about different things and could not yet see that the argument was making them both better. Clara let them argue. Jacob watched from a distance and said nothing except one evening. "They're going to be very good together." "Yes," Clara said. "Give it a year." "For the work," Jacob said. She looked at him. "For everything," she said. He accepted that without comment, which was either equanimity or strategic blindness, and she had decided she didn't need to know which. The Callaway contract brought 2 horses through in March and 3 more in April, and Ruth Callaway herself arrived in April to check progress, and stayed for 2 days, and left having signed an agreement for the following year's program, before she'd been in the buggy 10 minutes. "You charge too little," Ruth said on her way out. "I know," Clara said. "I'm adjusting the rate for next year." Ruth looked at her with the focused approval of a woman who recognized her own kind. "Good," she said. "Don't let anyone tell you what your work is worth. You know what it's worth." Clara thought about flour sacks, about a small room above a laundress's shop, about a notice on a board in Hargrove's general store. "Yes," she said, "I do." The Helena gathering was in May. She rode up with Jacob, which she had not expected him to offer, but which he offered without fanfare on the Tuesday before, saying only that he had business with Marsh anyway, and the timing was convenient, which was so transparently untrue that she didn't bother to challenge it. There were 61 women at the gathering. Not 43. The membership had grown over the winter, Genevieve Alderman explained, partly because word had traveled about the speaker. Clara stood in front of 61 women in a hall in Helena, Montana, in May of 1885, and she told them the truth. She told them about the general store and the notice on the board, and Eleanor Hayes's voice saying perhaps Clara should go. She told them about 4 miles in July heat, and a list of 17 items, and a barn with rotted stall supports. She told them about the council complaint and Commissioner Voss and Robert Kane, and the preemptive filing that turned defense into offense. She told them about the deed with 2 names on it, and the Callaway contract, and Henry and Franny and Pearl Hayes learning to stand still at a fence until a horse decided to choose her. She told them all of it plainly, without embellishment or performance, in the same direct voice she had used every day since she had walked onto Walker Ranch and decided to stop making herself smaller. When she finished, the room was very quiet for a moment. Then a woman in the 3rd row, middle-aged, practical-looking, with the hands of someone who worked outdoors, raised her hand. "The partnership deed," she said. "The one with your name on it. How did you get it witnessed?" And just like that, the room broke open into 61 conversations. 61 sets of questions, 61. Women with their own notices on their own boards and their own 4 miles in their own heat. Clara answered every question. Jacob stood in the back of the hall the whole time. She saw him there when she looked up between questions, standing with his arms folded and his hat in his hand and his face wearing the expression she had first seen across the bay mare's pasture. That quality of recalibrated attention, the look of a man updating his understanding of the world based on new evidence. After, when the room had thinned and the last questions had been answered, and Genevieve Alderman had pressed Clara's hand and said, "Next year, we'll need a bigger hall." Jacob came forward. He didn't say anything for a moment. She waited. "You know," he said that first day, when you walked up the road. "Yes," she said. "I watched you coming from about a quarter mile out," he said. "And I thought whoever that is, they came a long way." She looked at him. "You had no idea," he said. "How right you were about yourself." He held her gaze. "I don't think you had any idea." She thought about that. "No," she said honestly. "I didn't. Not then." "Do you now?" he said. She thought about 61 women in a room in Helena, their hands raised and their voices overlapping, each of them carrying a version of the same weight she had carried and looking for evidence that it could be set down. She thought about Pearl Hayes at the fence with her hat turning in her hands, and Ada choosing her in 4 minutes, and Pearl's laugh breaking open from somewhere undefended. She thought about Franny Pruitt's shoulders dropping 3 inches in a single afternoon. She thought about Henry Briggs shaking Jacob's hand with the expression of someone being handed a future. She thought about a small room above a laundress's shop, and a woman who stacked flour sacks and smiled at people who didn't smile back, and had underneath all of that, the kind of endurance that does not announce itself, but is simply there day after day, waiting for the right occasion. "Yes," she said. "I know now." Jacob looked at her for a long moment. Then he put his hat back on and offered her his arm, and she took it, and they walked out of the hall in Helena into the May afternoon. They married in June on the ranch in the yard that Clara had first crossed as a job applicant, with a small bag and a decision forming behind her eyes. The ceremony was small. Marsh came up from Helena, Dr. Alderman, and Genevieve came from Billings. Henry was there, and Franny was there, and Margaret Pruitt was there, and in the back of the gathered small crowd, standing slightly apart with Pearl's hand in hers, so was Eleanor Hayes. The minister from the next county read the service, and when he reached the part where he asked if anyone objected, the yard was completely silent, and the horses could be heard moving in the pasture, and somewhere overhead, a hawk made a long, lazy circle against the June sky. Nobody objected. Afterward, Pearl tugged on Clara's sleeve. Clara crouched down. "Are you going to keep teaching me?" Pearl asked. Very serious, very direct. "Yes," Clara said. "Even now," Pearl said, "that you're—" She thought about the word. "That things are different now." "Things being different doesn't change the work," Clara said. "The work is the work. That doesn't stop." Pearl nodded with the gravity of someone filing a contract. Then she said, "Ada likes me best, better than Franny." Franny, who was close enough to hear this, said, "That is objectively not true." And Pearl said, "It absolutely is." And Franny said, "I've been working with Ada since September." And Pearl said, "Longer isn't the same as better." And Clara straightened up and looked at Jacob, and he shook his head slowly with the expression she had translated as, "You are remarkable, and I am still getting used to it," and she laughed. A year after that, Walker Ranch had 12 horses in the training program, 2 full-time staff, Henry and a young woman named Bee from over in Cascade, whom Clara had interviewed for 40 minutes and hired on the spot when Bee had, without being asked, identified a tension issue in a horse's gait from across the yard. The Callaway contract had tripled. 2 other ranching families from the society gathering had become clients. Genevieve Alderman had in fact needed a bigger hall. Clara's name appeared in the Montana Agriculture Gazette that fall in an article about innovative horse training programs in the territory, written by Dr. Alderman, who had the distinction of being both professionally obligated and personally delighted to write it. Jacob read it at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning. He read it all the way through without comment. Then he folded the paper, put it on the table, and looked at her. "You've read it already," he said. "Last night," she said, "after you were asleep." "What did you think?" he said. She considered. "I thought," she said, "that the woman in that article sounds like someone who knew what she was doing from the beginning." "She did," Jacob said. "She didn't," Clara said. "She was terrified most of the time." "Yes," Jacob said. "And she did it anyway." He picked up his coffee. "That's not the same as knowing. That's better than knowing." She looked at him across the table. This man who had been undone by grief and had slowly, painstakingly, in the company of a woman who walked 4 miles in July, he'd learned how to be whole again. This man who had built something real and lost it and built it again. Different this time, better, in the ways that mattered. She thought about the morning she had stood in the yard of her rented room above the laundress's shop, with a bag at her feet and a decision in front of her. She thought about Eleanor Hayes's voice saying, "You know what I mean," and herself saying, "Yes, and I'm going anyway." She thought about a woman who could have stayed small her whole life and had chosen at the moment it counted not to. She thought about this notice on the board in Hargrove's store, the address she had memorized before she folded the paper and put it in her pocket, the way her hands had gone white around the tin she was holding, and the single breath she had pulled in and pushed out before she lifted her chin. She thought about all of it. Every piece of the road that had brought her here, to this kitchen, to this man, to this name on this deed, to 61 women in a hall in Helena asking questions with their hands raised. And she understood, sitting at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning in Walker Ranch, Montana, in the fall of 1886, that the road had not been something that happened to her. She had built it. One day, one decision, one step at a time, she had built every inch of it herself. And it had led exactly here, exactly home.